Greetings, my name is Alex McGrath. I am a music composition and computer science double major at Butler University. My composition, String Quartet in G, aspires to craft the image of a dream slowly being woven into a nightmare as time progresses. This string quartet is divided into 3 movements, each depicting a different section of a multi-part dream. The audience is transported through a variety of moods and experiences, from a romantic adventure to a mysterious dreamscape, and beyond, as the dream becomes increasingly unsettled and eventually devolves into a nightmarish experience. Various motivic and thematic material is presented to represent different aspects of each dream state, which is all linked together throughout the movements to mimic the subconscious threads that often connect dreams together. These threads evolve in a multitude of ways as the quartet continues, and ultimately define the form of each movement and provide an insight into how the dream turns into a nightmare. The first movement outlines a romantic adventure in a quaternary ABCA form that explores a multitude of scenes and dreamscapes. The opening begins with an extended introductory waltz. The main motif in this opening waltz is presented in the first violin part in measure 15, and consists of a falling arpeggiation followed by 2 notes descending stepwise. This motif is designed to represent the act of falling into a dream, which is more audible when considering that a similar falling tertian motif is presented in a 2/3 polyrhythm in the 2 violin parts in the very first measure. This rhythmic disturbance in the onset of the piece obscures the meter. The dueling hemiolas and falling intervals combined help to create this image of tumbling headfirst into an unknown landscape. The similarity between these motives links the introductory sections together into one big waltz, alluding to a romantic adventure that is about to unfold. When the A section of this movement begins in measure 43, it calls back to the initial 2/3 polyrhythm and waltz as the main motif of this movement is presented sempre pizzicato in the first violin. The first violin plays a dotted half note B, followed by a quarter note A, F sharp, and G, before passing the main theme across the quartet. This motif is presented to signal the start of the audience's journey through the dream, and thus is referenced consistently throughout the remainder of the quartet. This is the first appearance of a main motivic thread that is woven between movements. The pizzicato transitions to an arco presentation of the same theme, although this time the line is no longer split between the 4 players. Instead, each instrument plays the entirety of either the thematic or accompaniment material. The second violin enters arco with a syncopated rhythmic motif that reappears later to provide a rhythmic drive and also reinforce the material presented at this moment in the dream. A short transition from the A section to the B section occurs in measure 106, leading the audience through multiple tonal centers in quick succession, before arriving in C sharp minor at measure 110. The key of C sharp minor is a tritone away, and thus distant, from the opening key of G major, helping to cement the contrast between these 2 sections of the first movement. The B section then opens with the triplet motif stretto, featuring C sharp and G sharp, or Do and Sol. These entries in the cello, viola, and violin 2 parts signal the arrival of a new, more mysterious scene. Multiple fragments of this triplet motif and variations thereupon are presented throughout the scene, but a new pizzicato motif is especially noticeable in the cello in measure 120, that is a simple pizzicato sol-do resolution. This motif quickly returns in measure 124, and in the transition to the C section in measure 137, where it confirms the transition back to G major. This is the second major thread presented to the audience in this movement, and its strong sol-to-do resolution is designed to represent closure, even though it is not always presented at a cadence point. The C section is marked grandioso and signals a return to a more romantic, adventurous scene, especially when calling back to the falling dream motif from the opening in measure 146. The hemiola presented in the opening waltz is featured prominently as a lengthy journey is taken from the grandiose C section through increased rhythmic convolution to the reprise of the A section in measure 189. Along the way, 8th and 16th note duples, eighth notes, and dotted quarter notes are all played simultaneously, presenting elements of rhythmic chaos and agitation that culminate in the introduction of the third major motivic thread, a simple repeated 16th note motif that spans the interval of a third. In this instance, the motif is passed between the various parts in quick succession, creating further rhythmic excitement to build up to the return of the main theme. Later, this motif will be used profusely to represent chaos and unease, and the agitation inherent in its presentation here helps to link that emotion throughout the dream, although it still has plenty of room to evolve. The return of the A section at measure 184 is recapitulative without modification until the repeated 16th notes return, heavily featuring the third's motif presented earlier. The 16th notes are intended to continually provide a sense of agitation. Programmatically speaking, they continue up through the end of this romantic journey, to a climax that is meant to represent a chaotic tumble into a deeper layer of the dream. The tumble is represented through 3 simultaneous intervallic patterns, 2 ascending 3 and 6 note patterns in the violins, and a descending chromatic scale in the viola that ultimately culminates in the pizzicato closure motif in the cello in the final bar, which is meant to provide resolution that lays this adventure to rest, as deeper layers of the dream have yet to unfold. The second movement opens mysteriously, with a shifting major second motif slowly droning, with entrances at an interval of a minor ninth building from the viola to the second violin, and eventually the first violin. The cello enters in measure 15, but no indication of meter or key is provided until the downbeat of measure 21. The unusual 3+2 meter, clustered harmonies, and lack of clear metric pulse all help to contribute to a sense of uncertainty and mystery as the dream has shifted into a darker soundscape. However, when the cello and violins all land on the downbeat of measure 21, a slow broken waltz begins to form out of the combination of all 4 instruments' parts. Before the full dreamy waltz appears at measure 29, the second violin foreshadows its counter melody with the 3 notes in measures 25 to 28. In measure 37, the waltz returns to a broken state, and the meter again shifts between a 2+3 and 3+2 pattern, creating a sense of metric disruption. After the closure motif returns once more in the cello pizzicato in measures 43 and 44, the beat begins to stabilize, and a transition to a new, more active middle section begins. This transition is reinforced by the slow introduction of a cello ostinato through the upwards fifth motion featured in bars 51 and 53. This quintal motif opens each iteration of the 2-bar ostinato that is played throughout this entire middle section, first in the cello and eventually the first violin at bar 91. This ostinato provides the foundation for this section, and its prominent use of perfect fourths and fifths creates a very open intervallic motion that flows constantly and never settles until the fermata in measure 99 that concludes this section. Meanwhile, an offbeat pizzicato accompaniment is presented to add a layer of metric instability under the consistent pacing of the first violin's ostinato. This instability is meant to provide an air of unsettled mystery that indicates that this dream is slowly morphing into something unusual, far from the adventure experienced in the first movement. The middle section concludes with a ritardando, as the violins and viola end on open-ended high notes that provide little resolution before the waltz section returns in measure 100. The waltz slowly reanimates itself, rebuilding the harmonies and melodic lines from its first iteration in measures 21 to 28, but this time in a simple 3-4 pattern, and not broken or missing any beats. When the full, dreamy waltz returns in measure 104, the first violin begins to elaborate on its original melody, traveling into a higher register than before. Where the waltz had once returned to the broken 3+2 pattern in measure 37, the final section reprises the waltz with a sturdy 3 pattern that smooths out the metric imperfections and builds to another iteration of the closure motif in the cello, under an unresolved chordal chord. This suspension is not resolved, but rather leads directly to a short ending tag in which the 4 players try to find some form of resolution, but ultimately fail. In the last 2 measures, the cello tonicizes F minor with a re, mi, sol, do pizzicato line that hints at the sol to do motion of the closure motif. However, the final chord is also a chordal suspension that is left to hang openly without closure. Generally unusual harmonic colors and meters, or lack thereof, as well as a heavy emphasis on chordal and quintal melodic and harmonic structures, all help to provide this movement with a feeling of mystery and gentle unease. The instability should paint a picture of a dream that just can't quite be pinned down. Something about it feels off, but exactly what is unclear. The third movement is an adagio and scherzo. As the adagio progresses, it begins to unravel and evolve into a more chaotic scene. Suddenly, it is interrupted by the scherzo, which is intended to represent the descent into nightmare. The opening of the adagio begins in media res, or in the middle of things, in order to mimic the uncertain boundaries between different dreams in a sleep cycle. The opening 6 measures are designed to feel like the conclusion to a dream that has since been forgotten after awakening. However, the interval of a third in the cello in measures 5 and 6 immediately calls back to the first movement's use of this thirds motif to represent unease and agitation. The slower tempo of the adagio helps to suggest this feeling of unease, that something is wrong. This quickly gives way to a homophonic, somber main section that paints no clear harmonic or metric picture. As this section is initially strictly homophonic, it is more difficult to discern individual lines or melodic material, and with phrases and notes tied over bar lines, these measures are unusually obscured. However, after a brief pause in measure 11, each instrument begins to gain rhythmic independence, and the already unsettled dream begins to slowly spin out of control. A thirds motif is buried in the viola line between measures 12 and 13, further hinting at unrest. In measure 14, the second violin plays the main theme of the adagio, which begins with the G on the and of beat 2 and proceeds to the pause in measure 16. This theme reoccurs in the second violin in measure 19 and the viola in measure 20, and will play a major role in the scherzo as well. Faster note values gradually seep their way into the texture, accelerating as the cello and viola play the thirds motif in measure 19 to indicate something is very wrong. Immediately afterwards, the first violin calls back to the triplet motif of the B section of the first movement, while the cello arpeggiates the unease motif upwards, creating a fully diminished arpeggio that builds and accelerates directly into the scherzo. This quick succession of events, combined with rhythmic acceleration and rapidly descending and ascending lines, is intended to create an out-of-control feeling that indicates the descent into nightmare has begun. No sooner than the descent begins, a frenzied slew of martellato chord hits from the quartet signals that the onslaught of a nightmarish hellscape is about to ensue. After a short, unnerving pause, the viola enters in measure 25 with the minor thirds motif in an off-the-beat, repeated 16th note ostinato that drives the movement forward towards uncertainty. Bars of 3/8 at the end of each phrase create metric displacement, intended to throw the audience's sense of time off slightly with each iteration. The second violin plays a 3-note motif in measure 31 that calls back to the triplet motif that returned in measure 20, while the cello plays the adagio's theme, first fragmented, then fully, at measure 40. This theme also appears in the viola's pizzicato in measure 44. In measure 40, the viola also plays a small accompaniment figure, which, while initially unassuming, is actually a callback to the main theme of the first movement, note for note. As all these threads begin to weave together at the same time, the nightmare begins to take the shape of the dreams that preceded it, blurring the scenes and movements together. The pickup into measure 49 is another instance of the Adagio's theme, which is fragmented and sequenced downwards and smashed into another fragment of the first movement's theme. Combined with the uneven 5/8 meter and eighth and quarter note triplets in measures 52 to 54, any metric pattern or consistency is wiped out, instead chaotically tumbling headfirst into the B section of the scherzo. The color of the sul ponticello tremolo accompaniment here, as well as the violin pizzicato hocket, highlights an unusual timbre, intended to create a mystical but very uneasy respite from the chaos of the A section. The thirds motif appears briefly in measures 62 and 66 in the cello, between lush melodies that hint at a recapitulation of the romantic adventure from the initial dream. The cello takes over the arpeggiation from the violins with an ostinato that alternates between 2 and 3 beat patterns, and also calls back to the similar ostinato in the second movement. The pizzicato line in the viola and second violin that plays over this ostinato contains the first movement's triplet motif and the thirds motif, reinforcing prior material and further adding unease before a final pizzicato hocket in measure 82 leads directly back to the A section. The A section continues as before with little variation, proceeding abruptly and without transition to another offshoot rest area, section C, in measure 107. This new section paints lush greenery and peaceful pastures through a slower tempo and harmonic stability, in stark contrast to the nightmare that has been chasing the audience since the beginning of the scherzo. The cello and second violin call back to the first movement's theme in measures 108 and 109, but the escape from the chaos is short-lived, as the uneasy thirds motif returns in measure 115, amidst an intense sul ponticello tremolo in the viola. A short transition interrupts this peaceful landscape with mysterious pizzicato that quickly gives way to a fast, unrelenting, and oppressive thirds motif ostinato in the cello at measure 124. This unexpected D section is intended to act as the most intense and terrifying section of the nightmare, with rapid meter changes, unrelenting ostinati, and fragments of motivic threads strewn about to achieve this purpose. For example, in measure 143, the viola plays the first 4 notes of the Adagio's theme, and in measure 149, the first violin plays a fragment of the first movement's theme. Aggressive sforzandi, accents, and pizzicati continue to propel this section through hell and back until it withers away at measure 201, with a final fall in the violins. After a measure of uneasy silence, the initial slew of chord hits presented in the first measures of the scherzo reappears, although augmented, to indicate a return to the A section, this time for good. At the end of the second phrase, in measure 231, the first and second violins begin playing an alteration of the scherzo's A section theme, while thirds are passed between the viola and cello. An excited, grandiose coda in 7/8 begins at measure 247, with the first violin and viola presenting a truncated and energetic alteration of the first violin's original line from the A section, on top of the chaotic thirds motif. This idea continues all the way to the final 3 bars, which mirror the finale of the first movement, a simultaneous and chromatic ascent and descent in varying rhythmic patterns to the final note. Overall, the rondo structure of the scherzo is meant to portray a nightmare that chases after the audience through various reprieving refrains, before interrupting the couplet-refrain pattern with menacing imagery of night terrors in a sudden D section. This scherzo's representation of this nightmare intends to play with the audience's expectations, while continuing to link together and recapitulate themes and motives from earlier movements. My string quartet in G is packed full with various motivic and thematic material that is shared between or evolved throughout the 3 movements. By recapitulating motives throughout the quartet as a whole, the threads of this dream-turned nightmare are strengthened, connecting the emotions and dreamscapes to their counterparts in the nightmarish final scherzo. The feelings of excitement intended by the romantic adventure of the first movement, the mystery and instability of the second movement, and the uneasy homophony of the adagio are all woven into a complex texture in the scherzo, and the reinforcement of various motives helps define the form of each movement. The quaternary adventure of the first movement, the second movement's mysterious ternary form, and the scherzo's chaotic modified rondo form are all outlined by the main motives I have discussed thus far. Like most dreams, the specifics are often unclear or forgotten after the dream is over, However, motivic threads woven between the layers of the dream depicted by this quartet are intended to help the listener remember key moments, to allow them to construct their own narrative experience after the fact. Although many dreams are so easily forgotten, it is my hope that this dream-inspired string quartet is not.